and I'm also the second-year tutor. So I look after the entire second year, give them some general orientation, make sure that they're doing the right things, give them some advice when they need it, and generally help them develop their skills. So what I'm going to talk about today is a particular area of interest. I'm going to share my PowerPoint, hopefully, which will come up slowly. Hopefully. Charlotte, you can now see the PowerPoint screen?
Yep, all good.
All right, thank you very much. Yes, so what I'm going to talk about today is livestock. Now, conventionally, we look at livestock through animal bones, and just this morning, I've added these 4 images to this PowerPoint because I've been looking at this material this morning. These are bones from the site of Meroe in Sudan. Meroe was a civilization south of Roman Egypt, so independent of the Roman Empire, but a very important site, obviously trading with Roman Egypt. One of the most important things at Meroe is the iron producing industry, huge industries there, possibly providing iron, sending it further north up along the Nile. So my task was looking at the animal bones from these excavations, and on the left-hand side you can see a sheep pelvis with a little cut mark right in the center. Now that cut mark is very fine. It's a very fine bladed instrument has created that. And one of the things that is interesting in this collection is that even though the collection was excavated in and around huge slag heaps more than 6 meters high, which is just a huge amount of material, indicates that they are smelting on a full-time basis, using workshops, repeating episodes, etc., etc. They would have had lots and lots of iron, but that iron was not being made use of for butchery, at least in these assemblages that I was looking at. So that's an interesting conclusion in its own right. And then linking in with some of the things that Rodney was talking about, we can look at what else the bone might have been doing. In the center, you've got a humerus, which has clearly been burnt. All that discoloration, that has been in a fire. But interestingly, we also, on the bottom right-hand corner, have some bone that has slag on it. And my suggestion is that in the kind of environment that they were living in near Meroe, near the Nile in central Sudan, they would have had very limited wood resources. They would have been absolutely dependent on charcoal in order to run the furnaces. So therefore, they would have been having to go further and further afield in order to acquire wood for their furnaces, and they're not going to waste wood for basic kinds of tools. And so the reason that you've got slag on long bones in particular is because they are using long bones in order to be able to manipulate the iron blooms and other bits of red hot waste during the furnace processes themselves. Rather than having the odd stick around, that's simply far too valuable. They're using bone that's knocking around. And then at the top right-hand corner, you've got a bone paddle that would have been used to apply new layers of clay to the furnace themselves. So you can see bone being reused in a metallurgy context. So that's just to sort of give you an idea of what we can come across just when we're doing some basic work. Okay, so livestock in archaeology, it's one of the great success stories. Archaeology, as you can see on the top right-hand corner, archaeology has been able to prove that the main domesticates, sheep, cattle and pigs at least, sheep and goats, cattle and pigs, all come from the Fertile Crescent in the Near East, and that they spread from that area across Europe, across Asia, down into Africa. The emphasis in archaeology in relation to livestock has very much been in the early phases of domestication, and in this figure that I've created on the bottom left-hand side, you can see the dwindling interest as we move forward in time. So you get secondary products like the development of milk and traction and things like that. There's a little plateau there, and then there's a little plateau around states, and then there's sort of some surviving interests in pastoralists and ethnography in very recent times. What this focus on the very earliest times means is that we disregard later time periods. It means there's a diminishing significance given to livestock, and also there's a marginalization of rural areas from urban. We tend to focus on the urban areas and say, right, okay, this is where it's all happening. The rural areas are basically static, they are unchanging and insignificant. In particular, you've got these are a couple of images by Constable. On the left-hand side, you've got an image of Hampstead Heath as was in the 1820s, before London expanded. So that's looking across to where UCL might well have been being conceived. And you can see some ponies and horses in the foreground being used to mine some materials on the heath. You've got other animals grazing. These animals would have been brought out from the city in order to gain water, to gain pasture, etc. So it's something that we're overlooking in the archaeological records through our focus on things like domestication and the early time periods. Now that's in contrast to the significance of livestock today. There are something like 4.8 billion head of livestock produced annually, and that's excluding poultry. So we're talking about a huge presence. In 2018, that represented hundreds of millions of tons of meat and hundreds of millions of tons of milk. So it's a major entity. And also, livestock were responsible for forming 14.5% of all anthropogenic gas emissions. So they are a major contributor to global warming. So their presence is not unproblematic in the modern world. And you can see in the background image, that's a lone tree that's been left through the clearing of the Amazon. So in order to provide pasture for livestock, for cattle in particular. Now, livestock provide 18% of the world's calorie supply, but in order to feed them, they take up 83% of the world's farmland. So clearly, if we wanted to feed more people, we need less livestock and more focus on crop production, sort of direct returns for humans. That would be preferable in terms of reducing global warming. And what we have in the present day is the development of industrialized production. Now, the archaeological focus on earlier time periods tends to buy into the idea that modern livestock is unproblematic, it's scientific, it's industrialized, there's not a culture behind it. And so at its most extreme, you have places like this in the Texas Panhandle. This is one of 100 feedlots in the area. In the left-hand image, you can actually see further feedlots in the distance. You basically have stall-fed cattle, all being fed from industrialized grain silos, with rail networks providing the feed for the animals, with rail networks providing the linkages to the abattoirs and slaughtering facilities. So the top right-hand image is one of those. And in that left-hand image, you can see a great big effluent lake that is extremely toxic. If that gets released into the environment, it leads to catastrophic death. So if it gets into water systems, for instance, you have mass deaths of all living entities within that water. So it's a real problem. And it's not something that we should be simply glossing over. We should be recognizing these as essentially archaeological phenomenon, even if they're being produced in the present day. So how did archaeology come to this? It's dropping the ball and failing to look at the development of recent constructions within the livestock industry. Well, first of all, the archaeological reliance on bone in order to talk about livestock is problematic. So clearly I do work on animal bones, I do find them interesting, but we have to recognize that there's limitations to what we can do with that material. And I would argue that focusing on animal bone encourages us to look at animal presence or absence, meat returns and subsistence. It gives primacy to domestication, and it ignores the later impacts on human society and environments. Now, an example of why we need to rethink zooarchaeology is something that I looked at the other day. It's a really fantastic book, and it's an indication, it's useful for me to talk about in this lecture because it's an indication of how archaeology is frequently needing to reappraise how it does things. This is a lovely person called Krish Sita, who's now based in the United States, but he was raised in Brixton. During secondary school, he worked at the weekends as a butcher and paid his way partly through university as a butcher. And what he has done is he has approached the study of animal bones from the perspective of a butcher. And it's a fantastic book. It's incredibly thorough. But it's also highlighting how archaeologists have completely misinterpreted things in the past. You know, he's saying, no butcher can do this with a tool like that. It really doesn't make any sense at all. And these are people who he counts as, he's acknowledged at the beginning as his mentors. So it's just indicating how archaeology generally, by reappraising what it does, can do amazing things. What this highlights is that we need to go back to basic understanding of animals. And one of those basic understandings is the capability of livestock to become feral. There are all kinds of examples of feral populations, formerly domesticated animals that have become wild. I will focus in particular, just in this particular slide on the top right-hand one. That is Chris the sheep, who was found in the wilds in New South Wales in Australia. They sheared him and his fleece weighed 41 kilos. So the poor guy was carrying around this incredibly heavy fleece. They reckoned that he hadn't been shorn for 7 years. He'd managed to avoid fly strike and all kinds of other problems by surviving in the wild. If a sheep, which doesn't have a lot of advantages, is able to do that, then horses, pigs, what have you, are definitely able to. Now, I'm at this minute in Gordon Square at the Institute, and just this morning I've been listening to the parakeets, the budgies, wild budgies that have escaped into London, and just this year they've started colonizing the square outside the Institute. So even within inner London, we've got feral populations out there. So what this highlights is the process of feralization, and it's something that has been recognized in very recent times by geneticists. It's a genetic process of return to wild characteristics. So that means that, and it's been seen in island populations of chickens and sheep that have become feral, those populations lose the attributes which were selected for in domestication, sort of things like distinctive decoration in the case of chickens, which may have led to their choice in domestication. So, oh, I like the colors of that one. When a chicken is put in a forest situation, bright colors, not a good thing. A lot of predators out there. You want to sort of blend into the background a bit more. So that's a genetic change there. Acquiescence, the ability to get on with humans, not a good thing again. Populations regain attributes lost in domestication, so abilities to identify good forage, resilience in the landscape. And ultimately, what we can suggest is that domestication and feralization is something that is present in all herds and flocks, that there are individual animals that are more inclined towards feralization and escaping the whole time. It's always the same animals that escape. And there are certain animals that are more inclined towards going towards the humans. And depending on the situation, those animals may become more successful. So the value of feralization is that it recognizes agency of livestock, the ability of livestock to determine and control things. They are not dumb animals as people like to picture them, even into the present day. Feralization is something that explains heftedness, the ability of livestock to learn their terrain. This is something that's been seen in all kinds of different environments, such as mountain environments in Britain. And the ability to identify and access key resources. So key resources might be shelter, might be water, might be grazing, might be specific kinds of plants that they need for particular reasons. This inclination towards feralization explains the regular occurrence of feral populations and their ability to survive. And processes of feralization are absolutely crucial in colonization of the USA and Australia as well. So the different processes, but I won't bore you right now, but there's really interesting historical data about how basically colonists were unable to keep control of their animals, and their animals went off and found the key resources that allowed them to survive, and subsequently became major places for livestock breeding. In the case of the United States of America, that frequently meant that pigs invaded the cultivation areas of indigenous populations, thus setting indigenous populations against the colonists. And one of the reasons for their deteriorating relationships. And another question we can ask is whether feralization is overcome with industrialized farming, with our enclosures, with our fencing, with all our scientific procedures, with all our machinery. Is it impossible for animals to still have elements of feralization? No, It's definitely not. Animals are still dangerous. Here's a range of headlines where livestock or feral animals, actually no, mostly livestock, so not feral animals, have been involved in human deaths. In the case of cattle, it's where their care, their management has been reduced, so they're not having a regular human presence, so they become territorial over the field in which they're in, and then they will go and attack walkers who are exercising their rights to pass through that field. In the case on the left-hand side, it was an 80-year-old farmer who simply couldn't get out and look after the animals anymore. And even roosters are capable of death, albeit roosters fitted with blades for cockfighting. We also need to recognize how animals articulate human worlds. So in a range of different anthropological ethnographic settings, we can recognize that animals are kept in association with particular houses. You can see clusters of animals, these are small stock in this particular case, in association with individual houses or clusters of houses. That represents different ownership. Furthermore, each of these animals will actually be given a separate name, and their biographies will be understood. Who gave the animal to them? In what context were they given? What does the animal say about the owner? So these animals collectively and individually are shaping the place of herders within the overall society. They help to establish that this person is a significant person. And you can see in this image the two compounds towards the right-hand side are roughly the same size. The one on the left-hand side is rather smaller. That individual has lesser status. It may well be a son or somebody like that who's establishing themselves. We also need to recognize how animals articulate human worlds and environments. So that can be positive. On the left-hand side, in the Maasai context, you can see an occupied compound and two unoccupied compounds to the right-hand side. These have created what are known as glades. They are enriched soils which allow vegetation to thrive once the feces have broken down sufficiently, feces that are creating that discoloration. And actually, for centuries afterwards, we know from ecological studies that have been done, these glades become incredibly important for all herbivores, wild herbivores as well, to congregate upon because of the range of grasses that are sponsored. On the right-hand side, you've got some Ankoli cows in southern Uganda, and because of their presence, they're creating bushification. They've eaten up all the good grasses. The herders have been setting fire to the pasture to try and control the bush. And you can see the acacia thorn is dominating now behind these beautiful animals. So one of the things that this emphasizes is that we need to focus on living animals. We need to look at if we're talking about a 4-year-old bull, we need to look at the 1,459 days of life rather than the final day of slaughter, which is what we do if we focus on animal bones. And we can see when we do ethnographic work, this is a rather young me in the 1980s in Uganda, that entire human worlds revolve around cattle and the access to cattle and the relationships that are built around those cows. But we can also use that to challenge familiar scenes. So looking, for instance, at something from the classical world, from the Roman world. This is Chester's Fort on Hadrian's Wall. It is known that Chesters was for a while occupied by a cavalry auxiliary component, and recent work has demonstrated that actually the mounted soldiers lived in the same rectangular enclosure or room as their mount. So there's a very close bonding there. Also, we can see from the scripts from places like Vindolanda, which has the largest collection of Roman scripts in Britain, that there are some very livestock related themes being discussed. Here, somebody's saying he would have been to York in order to collect the hides, except that I do not care to injure the animals while the roads are bad. So we can see that there are actually livestock perspectives that can come through into scenarios that we would think, oh, that's been done. This is, you know, we know all about these kinds of areas. No, we can review those things. Also, the emphasis on pastoralists emphasizes language divisions, and something that the president of Uganda once chided me about was the poverty of the English language. He complained about being taught in English and having to read Dickens and Shakespeare. So very poor, very limited language. You only have one word for milk in your entire language. Well, I suspect that in the past that wasn't the case. This is an account from the lowlands of Scotland, written in English, and using entirely English words, and I will reward you handsomely if you can tell me what all of those words actually mean. A din stot, a branded stot, a rigged stirk, a humbly black heifer, a branded stirk. It indicates that specialist language was in use back then. That focus on living animals and more recent time periods allows us to recognize the increasing diversity of human roles and social relationships, which are rooted in livestock. And it also allows us to think about livestock landscapes. So I'll move on from this, but there's a lot of interesting scenarios there. One of the things we can do is to problematize modern livestock and to examine industrialization, exploring its development. This is a color waterprint of a pork packing facility in Cincinnati, which would have been absolutely essential in providing winter meat for people going further west into the Americas. And we can look at things like production. This is a major wool facility, shearing facility in Western New South Wales. In the bottom right-hand image, you can just see the kangaroos looking at me nervously. On the top left-hand side, you've got the wool shed, which was used at this station called Willandra. In 1931, some 80,000 sheep were shorn during a 14-week period, and basically they had a shearing crew who turned up and lived in the accommodation on the right-hand side, bottom right-hand side, with their own cook, etc. They would be shearing up to 100 animals a day. It was a major source of production. And then the bottom left-hand corner, that lovely thatched cottage, that's the rams accommodation, rams being absolutely paramount to this process. And you can see that in the ideological manifestations in Australia today. One last thing we can look at, and you will see this location when you come to UCL. This is a painting from 1835, sorry. It is now Mallet Place. It's where the science library is. You can see the portico of UCL in the background. You can also see the cranes and derricks to the right of the dome. UCL's portico was never finished. They ran out of money, which tells you something about UCL. Anyway, this scene indicates that prior to it belonging to UCL, the scenario, the location was actually dominated by stables and places for maintaining carriages in order to allow London to move. There was something like 300,000 horses. They all had to be kept, they all had to be watered, they all had to be fed, they all had to have bedding. You can see a boy with a red cap pushing a wheelbarrow with what's known as London mix. So horses produce something like 40 kilograms of manure a day. That's 12,000 tons a day across the city, or 4.38 million tons per year across the city. In 1894, the Times of London predicted that there was going to be a great manure crisis, and that within 50 years, London would be buried under 9 feet of manure. It didn't happen because of the internal combustion engine, but nevertheless, it indicates some of the stresses that people experienced. And it's worth pointing out that when you attend UCL, as we hope you do, you should not worry about the mud besmirched streets that would have been the case outside some 100, 120 years ago. Okay, so to wind things up, this approach that I'm suggesting provides an alternative that will recognize animal agency and which problematizes livestock throughout the human career, allows us to look at recent time periods. It provides a huge potential throughout global archaeology and throughout time. It allows zooarchaeology to reassess its primary areas of emphasis, and it provides a means for contributing long-term studies on the development of industrial farming and its impact on the global environment. We can actually now begin to make statements that are relevant to the kinds of global climate change debates that Rodney and others are contributing to. So, thank you very much for listening. I will unshare, and any questions?